are gaining access to faith traditions and spirituality beyond traditional congregational settings. People are expanding their understanding of what communities of faith mean. And so that's one piece. The other piece is just a recognition of the impact that chaplains can have in a variety of settings. So basically I'm seeing an increased need, increased focus.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Frank, what do you see?
I think it would be similar to Alice's comments. I think the broader phenomenon that we're seeing is the reorganization of religious life in North America. And where we see chaplaincy taking root, or I see chaplaincy as a part of a larger movement of individuals that are part of that reorganization of religious life. So I think we see it from the perspective of the schools. We certainly see that in terms of how congregations are reorganizing, but we see that as well where we see religious life being reorganized in the public spaces. And that's where I think chaplains have been, where we find the majority of their work. Historically, that's been the case, but also I think in this increasing environment of the reorganization of religious life, we see this. So it includes spaces outside of institutionalized religion, in some of the traditional sectors, of course, of healthcare, military, education, but also in some, as I think Alice's term was, non-traditional spaces. There's been a lot of literature written, actually, for example, in movements and organizing movements like Black Lives Matter. There was a lot of wellness and spirituality kind of chaplaincy-like work. These would have been more in kind of voluntary fashion. We also see it, I would say, though, real quickly, we do see it also in the reorganized institutions of religion as well. I think that because chaplains can be in those spaces in between, it's a connection to the public life that the church has somehow lost over the course of the last decades. I would see it both in terms of the reorganization of institutional life within institutions, but also in the spaces where religion is taking shape in the public sphere.
Let me ask Frank. I haven't seen the ATS data in several years now, but there was a trend that the MDiv degrees were overall declining slightly, and other degrees at the master's level were increasing. Is that trend still happening? And what do you see with regard to chaplaincy in those degrees?
Right. So the answer first to your first question, the larger trend, I think we'll still have to get a couple more years data to see if more, like, for example, last year, we actually saw a little bit of an uptick in terms of MDiv students. But if the trajectories continue, it's very likely that we'll see both the professional MA and the academic MA surpass the MDiv in terms of student enrollments. I don't think that's far-fetched to think that will still happen. In terms of how these have served in chaplaincy functions, because and again, it's if you read some of Wendy's research and others, how to define chaplain is part of the issue here. But if we're speaking in terms of kind of the professionalized, more healthcare based, the degree tends to still be the MDiv with, of course, some additional certification through clinical pastoral education. But I think what you see in terms of the deployment of how students are using these degrees is that there are some for whom ordination is, MDiv is not the requirement for ordination. And you find that some of these professionals can still use some of these shorter duration MA degrees to accomplish what the MDiv used to accomplish. But then again, the requirements of other training and certifications seems to be part of their educational portfolio if they're looking forward to being some form of a chaplain.
Yeah. So I'm hoping we can talk both about the sort of supply and training of chaplains and the demand in what you're both really describing as a kind of reorganized religious landscape. But let me ask you the question first, Frank, that you just brought up, which is the concept, right? I mean, who or what is a chaplain? I think for some people, the idea of chaplaincy is really old fashioned, right? It's Father McElhenney from MASH. And
Right.
you know, some people are calling themselves now more, you know, spiritual care specialists. So I just wonder, is chaplaincy the right concept? Or do we need a different descriptor for what this work is? Or just how do you think about that?
And again, this is kind of going a little outside of my purview as like an executive director of ATS. And this may actually be a more interesting question for someone like you, Wendy, who's done the research. But my sense is if we kind of look historically at how organizations and how religion is reorganizing, it's not uncommon to find the redefinition and the reorganization of categories and titles in terms of functions and how people perform functions within organizations and within religious traditions. Yeah, I think the name of it is significant because chaplaincy carries with it such a kind of formal weight of what chaplains used to do. And while I think there is some overlap in what we're seeing in the kind of broader area of spiritual care, resembles some forms of chaplaincy, it's still also departing in significant ways. Both kind of, while it still does kind of remain in that core of kind of presence ministry, how that presence takes shape and in what forms and in what places, I think is changing. So I think some redefinition is in order.
Alice, do you have a thought about this one?
Oh, Alice looks frozen.
Alice does look frozen.
I think maybe her video feed has, maybe she may have to reconnect here, huh?
Yeah, we'll hold the question. Oh, there she goes. We'll hold the question for when she comes back.
Okay.
Frank, while you're here, I wonder if what your thinking is about sort of changes in religious and theological education, either that are happening or that you might hope to have or hope to facilitate, you know, making some shifts to respond to this reorganized religious landscape, the potentially different places of chaplains. I mean, talk to us with your ATS hat on.
Yeah, surely. I'll answer that question, Wendy, but I would be interested, and again, I wasn't just deferring, but your thoughts about the kind of retitling or renaming what this function looks like, I think would be really informative, maybe not just for us as participants on this webinar, but also for those who are listening in, because I think just to acknowledge that there needs to be some reclassification or identification of what these terms are. But from you who've done the research, kind of, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts before I talk a little bit about the training or the pipeline. Yeah.
I mean, my sense is that there's no commonly accepted definition of chaplaincy in American religious life and culture. And we're actually getting ready to field a small national survey to try to figure out what fraction of people have contact with chaplains. And Michael Skaggs, our executive director, was doing some interviewing in preparation for that call or that survey. And what he found is if you don't tell people what a chaplain is, they have absolutely no idea. And so then we started giving them a definition, right? You know, the next few questions will ask you about chaplains. Chaplains are religious professionals who often work outside of congregations, like in the military or healthcare. And when you give people a definition sort of like that, they're able to answer the question. But I wonder about who the term works for, and I suspect it's generational. So I think that people who are a bit older, who might have been familiar with military chaplains through any number of, you know, reasons, are more comfortable with the term. I think for younger people and millennials, it sounds like an old-fashioned term. And so I'm really interested in the spiritual care experts, the use of those sorts of terms. I don't have what the right box is. It's like if we were going to do a marketing campaign, which is not what I'm in the business of doing, but if we were going to do a marketing campaign to help people know about the services that these individuals are providing in, you know, places as different as, you know, sports teams and homeless shelters, how would we describe the work? And I think that's a question for the field, really. And part of what we're trying to do in the lab is bring people together across the field that don't usually talk, because I think there might be an opportunity here for a different box. But Alice, you guys, we're glad you're back. How do you think about this question of, you know, what the category is or might be?
Well, I'm really interested in hearing Frank's thoughts and yours as well around this. And I think you're onto something. I would note that changing labels and changing terminology is often a difficult transition. It's not something that happens overnight or handily. But it's really great that you're paying attention to that. And I think that the theological schools that train people who do this kind of spiritual care are paying attention to these questions as well.
Mm-hmm.
At the AAR, we have, and I'm turning this a little bit, so if you want to come back to that, just let me know. We have for a number of years brought in chaplains, prison chaplains, from usually around wherever we have our annual meeting. We've invited them to come in for a workshop because what has been clear to us from at least the past is that many prison chaplains, like military chaplains, have been trained primarily in a Christian tradition, and that you can't, there's a legal requirement in prisons to pay attention to the incarcerated person's faith tradition. And so the AR has done some work around that. I know other places are also doing work around that. When I was at Chicago Theological Seminary, we basically came to the conclusion that somebody is not a competent religious leader unless they're competent in engaging in interreligious circumstances. And so how do you weave that not as an aside to all the degree programs, but an integral part of the program?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm just reflecting, Kelly West in the comments here has said, speaking from a correctional setting, the term chaplain is statutory. We can redefine it more easily than we can relabel it, which speaks, Alice, to exactly what you're speaking.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Frank.
No, I was going to say, you know, another sector, and this kind of points to the reorganization of religious life. When I was the president of McCormick Seminary, there was a lot of talk about basically, and these weren't necessarily religious professionals, who could serve in, for example, a business sector.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes these were staff pastors and sometimes they weren't. But this conversation that business organizations or corporations wanted to have about ethics and the connection to their deeper spiritual lives of what they do, that's again, it, you know, if you could make fuzzy some of the lines that have defined chaplaincy in the past, mm-hmm. you wonder if this is not also some of the form that you're trying to speak of, this emerging form that you're trying to give name to.
And I mean, Sue Wins, I was just going to say, Sue Wins is jumping on this in the comments also, kind of making the point that the term religious professional is not used by all of the associations. And certainly, I mean, I've interviewed 65 chaplains in Boston working in as many sectors as possible. And some of them are, quote, religious professionals, and some of them are not. So I don't think Michael's on here, but we played with these definitions to figure out if we should include the professional part. And to be honest, I said that's what we were using, but I'm not actually sure that's where we came down, because you know, not all the people who are doing this work are a professional in the way that others think about it. Let's turn just to talk a little bit about kind of the supply, you know, what you see or would like to see in terms of theological education, trying to address or train or sort of respond to some of the shifts you're seeing around chaplaincy.
Right. And again, I think that this would be part of a broader shift in theological education. You know, I would say, first, I would always qualify that still the majority of students that attend ATS schools both self-identify and enter seminary with the idea of doing some form of ministry. And they see that as part of their vocational identity. One of the limitations I think that seminaries have had in the past is that that has almost been synonymous with professionalized clerical ministry. And I think, and again, this is drawn not just from data that we have at the ATS. I think that still tends to be a stronger case than most would admit, that even with the kind of reorganization of religious life, a lot of folks go to seminary with the intention of being some form of a religious minister. And again, in most cases, that tends to be professionalized ministry. And when they exit seminary, they still think of that as part of the vocation. Now, whether they actually have the opportunity to live out that vocation becomes some of the question.
Mm-hmm.
But as it relates to this kind of broader trend, I think one of the things that I experienced, again, as a president at a Protestant mainline seminary, was that we had a number of students who would continue to take the MDiv, who thought of themselves as ministers in training, but who would end up going into positions that they would think would be broadly termed ministry,
mm-hmm.
but were not recognized by denominations as being traditional ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Some of this was in nonprofit work. Some of this was in other work in the public sector, in terms of advocacy for different kinds of issues and nonprofit life and organizations. But, and again, a fair number, and in my time at McCormick, an increasing number that saw themselves as chaplains. And when I, you know, and this is more anecdotal than data driven, those who were seeking that kind of role, I think that why they found satisfaction vocationally was still somehow connected to this identity of ministry and being a minister, but wasn't tied necessarily to employment within or service within a congregational setting. And that for them was a good space for many of them to want to be in.
Mm-hmm.
So again, what I'm suggesting by this is that and these were mostly MDiv students that I would be speaking of. So what I think we have happening, and I do think that we have some of this evidence in the data among ATS schools, is that while even in the MDiv, students are now using the MDiv for very different purposes, mm-hmm. To reach certain trajectories for their goals vocationally and in other ways. And I also think that that's where we see the growth in the professional MA, especially, mm-hmm. as we find folks who find that this training is really good for what they were hoping to do. And many of those have really no intention of necessarily serving in a congregation. Some do, and again, I'd say a good chunk of them do, but some of them are actually seeking to serve in other capacities in forms that they would consider to be ministry, mm-hmm. but are not clerical forms of ministry.
Yeah. Part of what's interesting is we have this project going on right now with support from the Luce Foundation, where we've tried to look at what theological schools are doing around chaplaincy. And so we've created a database of about 320 schools, and about 80 of them have some sort of training program in chaplaincy or spiritual care. Some are MDivs, some are MAs, some are DMINs. And at this point in the project, we're actually starting to try to pull the curriculum, because our sense is that there's not a lot of overlap in the curriculum. And in some of these places, quite a few of them actually, it was sort of, you know, entrepreneurial leaders who created these programs, and they're being run by just one or two leaders. And so the question of how you continue them over time is an interesting one. And we've seen some PhDs also. We're just trying to sort of lay out the landscape so we can sort of see empirically how theological schools are trying to prepare chaplains, and then how much commonality there is across the different schools. Because it just seems like a really important thing to understand the data, then we can sort of figure out how to go forward. Alice, can you jump in here and share how this looks from your perspective? I appreciate you're coming from the American Academy of Religion, but do these issues cross your radar?
In a couple ways. I'm curious about what will happen in maybe 10 years as we're thinking about people who are spiritual care providers. If you think about the younger folk nowadays, you know, teenagers or those just getting ready to go into college, we see data about keen interest in having a positive impact in the world that may or may not be related to faith traditions, and certainly not to what we have considered to be mainline or evangelical traditions. So it will be interesting to me to see how that takes shape in religious studies majors mm-hmm. in college, and then what those students, how they deploy it. You know, if they see their their vocation in the world as doing community development work, and how is that going to intersect with what we've considered in the past to be chaplaincy studies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have a prediction? Do you have a guess?
No. No, none I want to make anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wonder, Wendy, if there isn't an analogy though, because there's some really interesting shifts that are happening here that are similar to, we saw maybe a couple decades ago some similar shifts in, like, for example, the field of missiology, right? Some very different emphases, kind of reevaluating mission work, kind of in light of colonial and post-colonial realities, for example, right? So there's a whole reevaluation of how folks think of mission, which then begins to also then redefine and reshape what we think of missionaries or people who function within that kind of mission capacity within religious organizations or outside of religious organizations, right? That's where you begin to hear this language of local mission and these kinds of things taking place. And it feels like a similar kind of shift that's happening with chaplaincy, where there used to be a very formal role, as there was for missionary, for example, that carried with it a lot of baggage and a lot of past and tradition. And it seems like we're seeing a shift in what that religious function looks like, both within religious organizations and in the public sector. And there's a component of that that's also related to professionalism. At one point, I think in one of your white papers, you actually talk about the business model for all of this. Is there a sustainable business model for the work of chaplains, or whatever we're going to call this group? But there's also a simultaneous shift in the field in terms of how to understand this. And I wonder if that's the kind of thing that we're seeing, both in the work that we're seeing in ATS schools, but in the work that Alice is naming in the academy, kind of a shaping of a field at the same time as we're seeing a new religious function or an old religious function that's taking new shape.
Well, and I mean, before we go to talk about supply, I wonder if we could pause for a minute and ask the question of what is the field, right? And I mean, my sense is that often people who work in a particular sector or know about a particular sector of chaplains aren't so aware of people in other groups. And so this project that I'm trying to write a book about in Boston, where I interviewed these 65 chaplains, and there's a great conversation happening here in the chat box about, you know, what kind of training chaplains need to have. And just for the record, I mean, I interviewed 65 chaplains in Boston. More than 3/4 had an MDiv, but only half had completed any CPE, and only 1/3 were certified by an organization as a chaplain. So there's what different professional organizations think chaplains are or should be. And then there's a completely separate question of who on the ground in the day-to-day world is calling themselves a chaplain and what work are they doing? And my data suggests that there's actually a pretty big gulf there, and that there are, you know, a fair number of people who are, I mean, anyone, this is sort of, you know, America, we can call ourselves as we will. People are doing chaplaincy work and calling themselves chaplains, but, you know, half of them have CPE. So when you get down and see the data, I think you've got to think about the field. And what the field looks like on the ground, and then how. And I mean, part of what we're really trying to do with the lab is bring the people together that are seeing different parts of the, you know, elephant, or whatever the right metaphor is, to think, is this a field? Should this be a field? What would it mean to support this group as a field in terms of both the research and the education and the people doing the work? So let's talk a little bit about the supply. And I think, Alice, you were saying early on that you have seen kind of more of a kind of in need or more of a focus around chaplaincy. I have wondered often if, you know, particularly millennials who maybe don't have local religious leaders might sort of have more of a demand, might be more interested in working with chaplains that they meet in the emergency room or in a disaster setting or whatever. I was talking with a young woman the other day and I mentioned this sort of idea, and she kind of looked at me and she said, but my peers don't even know who a chaplain is. They wouldn't know what to ask for. And so I guess I just wonder what your thoughts are about supply. This is back to the question about whether the chaplaincy is the right box or package for this work. This is a big sort of amorphous question, but Alice, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that who gets to define what chaplain means is an important question. And for the people who have done the the work that has traditionally defined chaplain, you know, the MDiv degree and the CPE and all those requirements, there is meaning to them about that standard.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to be careful not to just throw out that standard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably everybody would agree with that. At the same time, we want to create space for new things to happen. So I kind of see it coming in a both and way instead of a either or. You know, the same kind of question that seminaries are facing today. Well, we've built the very best thing. People need to come to it. Well, okay, maybe so, but that's not always the case. So how do we honor the solid work of the traditional chaplaincy, MDiv, CPE, all those requirements, and at the same time create space for other conversations to happen? And how does that overlap with theological education? How does that overlap with the Academy of Religious Studies?
Mm-hmm. Well, and how does it overlap with the people who are giving out the jobs?
Right. Well, then that's a great question.
I mean, because in the military and in healthcare, there are pretty clear standards, and it seems to me like most organizations are approximating those standards. But if we pick on colleges and universities for a second, you know, many colleges and universities have or are looking to employ chaplains. And here at Brandeis, actually, we're looking to hire a new director of religious and spiritual life. And when I was trying to sort of help a little bit write the job description, it was a very interesting question about, you know, well, what qualifications does this person have to have? And so when you think that many of the people outside of prisons, military, healthcare, who are hiring chaplains are very likely not themselves chaplains, this may not be clear to them. And how do we think about particularly what's happening in the theological schools and people who want to do this work? How do we help them get prepared for the work in a way that will be recognized by the people who are doing the hiring?
So it could be interesting to think about two things. One, I want to go back and really emphasize that it's no longer functional in our society for a chaplain or somebody doing that kind of work to be prepared in one faith tradition. Mm-hmm. That's no longer acceptable. The other thing is, what if there was a concept of like certification stamps? Like if you're a graphic designer, you can have a degree in graphic design, but you also might need a stamp of certification for your proficiency in Photoshop, your proficiency in InDesign. So what if there's a kind of a passport stamp for spiritual care provision skills and abilities?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I will say on the theological school side, and this isn't directly answering your question of supply, Wendy, we have seen at least in certain sectors, a movement and some energy around the idea of framing theological curricula around competencies, mm-hmm. Rather than just kind of the traditional four fields of Bible and theology and these kinds of things. And again, you know, that model of theological education has been around for a long time. It's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting to note this shift to competencies. It's both in broader higher education, but we've seen in theological schools as well. And one of the best practices that those schools that have embodied competency-based education, for example, is that they really try to gather information and survey those who need that kind of leadership. Say, like whether it's a local congregation or it's a nonprofit organization, asking the questions, what do you require from your leadership? What are those competencies that your leadership requires? And then you kind of reverse design from that point, mm-hmm. what resources and to be able to demonstrate and help a student demonstrate how those competencies can be met, or how they can demonstrate that they have those competencies. And I wonder if that kind of shift is also a space in which we could think about future folks who would want to be practitioners within, again, this field, broader field of spiritual care. Mm-hmm. Because there is, as you noted in trying to drop this job description, some very key points that would make this person more effective within that job role.
Mm-hmm.
But to your question about the hiring process, and that is, you know, again, I think because we're in this moment of reorganization of institutional life in religious circles, you know, eventually the functions become the formalized jobs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that's what we're at the stage at, is we seem to have identified the functions. The functions are being identified through these different practices and the ways that these folks, whether they're traditional chaplains or kind of broader spiritual care professionals or not professionals,
Mm-hmm.
They are fulfilling a certain function within religious life that eventually in this reorganization process that at least with that's an open question. Are we moving to that model of professionalizing those new functions,
Mm-hmm.
or is the organization taking a completely different shape in general? Because another thing that we see in religious organizational life is that there are religious organizations and bodies, congregations, faith communities that don't rely as heavily on religious professionals as traditionally the church has.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so
and there's
that's a way to kind of just point to your direction of in terms of who hires.
Mm-hmm.
That's still an open question.
Yeah, and I can't keep up with the chat box, but I mean, there's an interesting conversation going on about, and just the need to be really clear that right now you do need certain education to work in a prison setting, a different kind of education to work in a healthcare setting. I picked universities because they're a little fluid. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's not a single standard that colleges and universities sort of, you know, grab onto. There's also just some question about the chaplains that I interviewed. About half of them worked full-time and half of them worked part-time. So at least in Boston, there are a fair number of chaplains who are sort of piecing together different positions, some all in chaplaincy, some with a congregation and in chaplaincy. And almost 90% of the people that I interviewed were paid something for their work as a chaplain, because there's also this question of what is work, right? And some of them are volunteers, without a doubt, but about 90% of them were paid, and a third of them are or were city employees. And these are the police chaplains, the fire chaplains, the prison chaplains at every level, some of whom are stipended. I mean, you could only pay your rent for a few months with that money, if that at all. But when we broaden up the sort of frame and look at who's doing the work and then think about the competencies, I think for me, it raises some interesting questions about, you know, do we as a group, including all of you who are listening in here, feel like there are certain things that all chaplains need to know? And if so, could we sort of articulate them? But then there's this question about, you know, regulation. This is not a licensed profession. So, you know, the Boston Fire Department can hire whoever the Boston Fire Department wants to be their chaplain. And that's not something that any of the educators have a say over. And so I just think it's really important to keep the supply and demand in line here. Let me see if I can go to some of the questions that have been coming through. We've got a bunch of them. One of them was about the demographics of chaplains, and particularly the potential influence of more women getting MDivs and any impact that might have had on chaplaincy. I don't know if either of you have a sense of the sort of gender story in MDiv training and how that might impact chaplaincy, or if that's something we need to get the data for and then come back to Carolyn, who's asking the question later.
So this is a question about whether there's a gender data point with regards to those who are becoming chaplains?
Or who are getting MDivs. And then if that might be influencing what's going on with chaplaincy.
Right. There have been an increasing number of second career students, I would say that the term, in terms of genders in MDiv, the numbers have been relatively flat, but there have been we did see a bump in women's participation in MDiv right around the turn of the century, or the turn of the millennium, right? Really is where we began to see that. So it's an interesting question, and I don't. I think we would have to do a little more kind of integrated data analysis to be able to examine whether or not what percentage of those women would be going into more chaplaincy kinds of roles and these kinds of things. But yeah, I don't. I don't think that there's necessarily a correlation between that and the kind of emergence of the role of chaplaincy related to the MDiv and the demographics of the MDiv, at least at this particular.
Okay. Alice, anything on this one?
Oh, no, I'm out of that data right now. So.
Okay. All right. So we have
Alice did serve at one point on the Board of Commissioners, so that's she keeps on alluding to this of being in touch with that data. So
I used to live and breathe it, but not anymore.
All right. So here's another question coming from Jason Zudma, who works in maritime ministry. He said, I work in the field of maritime ministry, chaplains serving seafarers working on ships, visiting ports around North America. A key difference often expressed in our work is that it is not just skills in pastoral work, but also other management skills. Chaplains are often expected to run the larger seafarers ministry with staff and volunteers, with the key expectation that they can raise funds. Yet they didn't teach me that in seminary as a standard comment. How do chaplains get this kind of training in the normal MDiv CPE route? Or a different way of asking the question is broad or should broader education be on the horizon for chaplains who are working outside of organizations and have to deal with a lot of administrivia, fundraising, et cetera? It's a great question.
This is a great question, and it's across the board. The entire time I was president at Chicago Theological Seminary, those kinds of questions would come up. Management preparation questions, and also leadership development. You know, just because somebody gets training in the classical disciplinary model, gets learning and knowledge and experience in the theoretical work that we've all been trained in, doesn't mean they automatically become a leader. So what ought our schools to be doing around leadership development? And I would advocate that leadership development be the core of the degree program, and then let the theoretical disciplinary areas go on top of that. Where do people get the management development, which I think is different from leadership development, but where do they get that? It's not happening all that much, at least in my memory of what's happening in theological education. Maybe you have a little more data on that, Frank.
Yeah, well, I will say that we recently did a survey of theological education alums. One of the big takeaways from that survey is the increasing amount of administration that graduates are doing in their current professions, both in ministry context, in education context, and in other contexts. So I think what we are seeing then is a broader trend within religious life of the need for administration as a necessary skill of fulfilling that vocation. That certainly is the point is such a good one. I will say as well, we've learned a lot through one of our initiatives called the Economic Challenges Facing Future Ministers Initiative at ATS, about how important at early stages getting some sense of financial literacy and awareness. So there's different components of administration, but certainly one of them is how to have some financial literacy, but also awareness of how to run organizations from a financial point of view, but also to think of how one manages one's own finances. One of the things that this survey has really uncovered is this used to be taken up primarily through the bodies like a church or an organization or a denomination that would do a lot of the funding for theological education and these kinds of things. And what we're finding is that is increasingly now put on as a responsibility of the individual. And I think that goes to what you were talking about as well, Wendy, in terms of your survey. How does one begin to build a business model if you're basically a consultant? You're using a consultant model for your vocational life. These kinds of things are part of, that have never been historically part of our theological training at schools, but increasingly we're seeing that these, both the broader umbrella of administrative capacity, but also the ability to have some financial literacy and awareness of how organizations run and how you as a potentially religious professional could live out your life, given the economic challenges that the educational process itself creates.
Mm-hmm. We've thought a lot about this through our work with the Transforming Chaplaincy Project, and are launching a management certificate program this summer that we hope that some healthcare chaplains will be able to convince their employers to pay for them to complete. And I mean, the critique is that to the extent that theological schools are now preparing people to work in all of these non-congregational settings, they need these sets of skills. And many of the theological schools simply don't have people who are trained to teach this stuff. So I feel like there's an opportunity there. There are a lot of really interesting comments. I might just share a few comments and see if they spark anything for either of you. A few panelists have noted that this is a very American conversation, which I think it absolutely is. So Anya Visser, a colleague from the Netherlands, I would guess from the comments, says, in the Netherlands, we've been working with a competency model and registration of chaplains for a number of years now. Perhaps this would be interesting in your context to have a look at. And there were a few other comments from chaplains working in European contexts. Another comment about the gender differences, particularly for non-Christian chaplains. And Pamela says she sees a large number of women in training more than men, especially Muslim women. And we've actually seen the same thing in some of our data. We think that especially some of the MAs in chaplaincy are giving a kind of credential to people from non-Christian Jewish backgrounds that they need to work in healthcare and prisons, in other settings, in a way that is both very gendered and kind of creating other opportunities for Buddhists, Muslims, some Hindus, fewer Hindus. So there's sort of a religious diversity piece here too, that I think is about kind of trying to make this work in the American context. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts either about European comparisons or about non-Judeo-Christian traditions and individuals seeking to train in chaplaincy environments.
So when I was at Chicago Theological Seminary, we had a number of female Muslim students who were moving in the direction of chaplaincy, and one of them purposely wanted to do the MDiv program because of the certification that comes along with it for chaplaincy. I mean, it was an interesting and healthy process for our faculty to have to examine what we had been requiring in the MDiv and how to make it a meaningful MDiv for someone from a Muslim tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say that, and again, I share this more anecdotally. When I was at McCormick Seminary, it was often the case in the narrative of especially women and women of color. So this was still a more of a Christian conversation, where there was a similar dynamic because of maybe the kind of confessions of their tradition or that restricted women's leadership. This was often an avenue which they could pursue within their tradition that was also a form of religious leadership where they felt called. So in some ways, I think that this is another pattern that we're seeing. I think we're seeing it in other religious contexts as well, where we see that there are women who are committed to and dedicated to a life of ministry, but the vocational, and here I would include the vocational and paid vocational positions within their traditions, are just not there. And so this is where they find themselves to have a vital play and role in ministry, but where they also sense a sense of fulfillment within their own tradition without having to leave their tradition to be able to fulfill their vocation.
Wendy, in your work and in your study, have you looked at certifications from other countries like the Netherlands?
We haven't, for this kind of work, we haven't looked outside. The Transforming Chaplaincy Project has done some comparison internationally. We sort of felt like we had our hands full starting in the US, but very much hope as the lab continues to get going to figure out how to learn from our colleagues in other places, because I think in many ways they're way ahead of where we are. This has been a really rich conversation. I don't know, Alice or Frank, if either of you have some kind of concluding thoughts before we wrap up. I have to teach at 1 o'clock, so I'm being mindful of the time. But are there things that you'd like to say before we wrap up?
I have been glancing at the side at the comments going on. There's some really great conversations happening that I hope people will follow up on. It's really great that so many people are interested in this conversation, and that means some rich thoughts are going to come forward from it.
Right. And that's what I would just echo. I've been also following the stream of thoughts that have been appearing, and there's some conversations, full-blown conversations going on in the chat stream. In some ways, you know, when you host a webinar like this, it's not that we're gathering experts here. I think what we're doing is we're convening a larger conversation. And I think that's what I'm grateful for the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, is that really, Wendy, under your leadership, we're convening some very interesting broad conversations about how to define and figure out what this phenomenon is that we're calling under the broad umbrella of chaplaincy, but is obviously a redefinition of that very term. So to continue to convene these kinds of conversations is, I think, the innovative work that we need to continue to do.
Well, thanks to both of you. The comments that are on the side, Michael Skaggs has a way to kind of capture them. So we will try to share them with all of you. And to the extent that you want to be put in touch with each other, we're really happy to do that. We really see ourselves as a convener, not at all as someone who has all the answers. I might say that the American Academy of Religion has just allowed the Chaplaincy Lab to sort of be, have some sessions, be a kind of formal section of the AAR moving forward. So we'll have a space there to be in conversation. And we really do want to hear from all of you of what you need. So send us webinar ideas. You know, we're making this up as we go along, and we want to be making it up with all of you. So Michael Skaggs is your best contact person. He's awesome on email. So let us know what you need, what we can do. This webinar will be posted on the lab's website, as well as I think on YouTube, but Michael can help you with that. So thank you, Frank. Thank you, Alice. Michael, thank you. You're awesome for keeping this all together. And thanks everyone for being with us. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.